Welcome to Not Entirely Unlike Tea with Christine Collins. Hey there, it's Christine Collins, and one of the topics that I see a lot of people struggle with, and I have as well at different times in my life, is sleep. It is one of the single most important things that we need for our health and our overall physical and mental well-being. You have probably heard many of the common things that are worthwhile trying: having a cool, dark bedroom or sleeping area, making sure that you cut off eating and drinking at an early enough time that you're not disrupted during the night, checking on things like your mattress, your bedding, and your overall sleeping environment, as well as reducing blue light and electronic usage with enough time before you are going to bed. Those things I feel like are talked about often enough that they're almost common sense for us at this point. So I wanted to look into some other things that are worth at least knowing about, with a great big notice that I'm not a sleep expert and that we are all very, very unique and different. And so even though something may work for one person or for me, or I mention it, that doesn't mean that it's going to be effective for everybody else. So one of the things that I found really fascinating was to learn and understand a little bit about how sleep has evolved and has been influenced and impacted by our culture and personal life balance. There was a time when biphasic sleep patterns were more of the norm, where people would sleep for like 4 hours and then wake up during the night, do something quiet, and then go back to sleep for another 4 hours, or roughly around that amount. And this was known as first sleep and second sleep. And the reason why I found this so fascinating is because at times when I've really struggled the most with sleep and having a lot of sleep anxiety, which is not unusual if you've ever had any difficulty with falling asleep or staying asleep, some of that sleep anxiety, or like almost like a performance anxiety of needing to get to sleep, was alleviated by breaking up the pattern. Instead of having this thing kind of hanging over me of, oh, I need to get down for 8 hours, I've got to figure out, how to sleep in this great big chunk of time, I started to unintentionally fall into a pattern of sleeping for a few hours in the evening and then getting up and doing some things and then going to sleep again. And what was shocking for me about learning that this was actually kind of a thing, and of course it's going to look different today in our modern world, is to understand that it may actually have been effective for me and for some others, because I do know that a lot of other people who have attempted that actually found it worked for them. And I also know some people that it didn't work for. So again, just mentioning how unique we are. One of the things that is a challenge is artificial light. So at a time, obviously a very long time ago, when we didn't have electricity, and there wasn't so much of a temptation to get up in that interim and do things that involved using electronics and looking at screens. But it could be an interesting thing to play with, particularly if you find that the idea of laying down for 8 straight hours or 7 straight hours creates a lot of anxiety for various different reasons. There are some elements of almost like a nap or a biphasic sleep pattern. And there are many things that are worth looking into further. There are circadian rhythms. There's an impact of melatonin. Things like daylight and exposure to sunlight can have a big effect on when we start to feel sleepy and when we feel the most alert. And one of the challenges for people who work at night is that they're not necessarily getting early morning sun exposure. They're often sleeping at that time. And so playing with things like exposure to sunlight as early in their day as possible can be beneficial as well. It also helps to understand some of the different stages of sleep. And I have a familiarity with this because of being a hypnotherapist, but we understand that when we are the most awake or alert, we're in particular brainwave patterns. And then as we're dozing off, getting sleepy, getting tired, we slip into deeper brainwave patterns. And then when we're fully asleep, we go into the delta or sleep brainwave pattern. In hypnosis, we know that the alpha and theta brainwaves are kind of that sleepy twilight in between being fully alert and awake. awake and being fully asleep. And so, of course, we have beautiful tools that can guide us more gently into some of those deeper brain waves. And some of those tools, in addition to hypnosis, are tools like Yoga Nidra. And another aspect of Yoga Nidra that's very beneficial is progressive muscle relaxation and guiding the mind through a journey that kind of tires out the mind while relaxing both the mind and the body and guiding us into those deeper brain waves. And hypnosis, which guides us down into the alpha and theta brain waves, it's like a guided journey that also occupies your mind with these visualizations and this guided imagery in a way that can sometimes alleviate the anxiety of trying to fall asleep and is a lot more effective than trying to count sheep or those types of things. But that said, there are some more active activities that can be done that also tire out the mind and occupy it just enough that allow it to relax. And this is especially good if you have an overactive mind and it is at night that your mind starts racing and you start thinking about things or worrying about things. And that is part of what is delaying your ability to fall asleep. So doing things like coming up with a letter and thinking of as many different words as you can that start with that letter. Or if you have enough knowledge, you can pick a topic like types of flower or types of tree or types of animal, as long as you can go for a little while in that subject category. And it's actually pretty interesting how effective some of those practices can actually be. I've tried them myself and been surprised that I did fall asleep in many cases while doing those exercises. It does require a little self-discipline to stay on whatever the activity is and not allow your mind to wander off into the area that you're worried about. And that's where having a guided meditation, guided hypnosis, or guided yoga nidra can be extra beneficial because you're sort of following along while someone else is guiding you. And so it's a little bit more of a relaxed process versus an active thinking process. So I think a lot of it is trial and error and just playing with different tools and exercises to kind of see what works for you. A lot of people also find reading has the same effect on them, provided that you choose a book that is not too exciting. As many of us who like to read have probably made that mistake at some point along the way where you lay down to read and you think you're going to read and then doze off. And sometimes even if I'm feeling pretty tired and I think I'm going to fall asleep quickly, I can get very engrossed in a really good story and end up staying awake reading. So making sure you choose material that is actually relaxing in some way. One thing that has worked well for me and for others I know is choosing a book you've already read that has a relatively calm theme or relatively non-active things happening that aren't likely to knock you out of your sleepy state. There are also things like sleep hygiene, which you may already be familiar with, the practices that you do prior to attempting to go to sleep that allow for a period of winding down. And I do think that that looks different for different people. I know some people who can read or watch something that's pretty exciting and still fall asleep without too much difficulty, and other people who really need to have like an hour at least between stopping stimulating activities and shifting into that sleepiness. And that wind down may include things like creating a temperature contrast, like showering or taking a bath before bed, which can help to trigger the body's natural thermoregulation response, linking us into sleep onset. There are breathing activities that some people find to be beneficial, breathing in for 4, holding for 7, and exhaling for 8 seconds. And that can help to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is bringing us down, relaxing our body. Some people find vestibular stimulation helpful, so gentle rocking motions and even envisioning those. In hypnosis, we use some of this in our imagery in terms of envisioning being on a hammock and swinging gently back and forth, or being on a boat or some other similar structure like a train ride, for example, that has kind of a natural rocking sensation. Another thing that I think many of us may not have thought of is that when we're planning bedtimes and wake-up times, recognizing, of course, that we don't always have full control over those things, but when we can impact what time we go to sleep and what time we're going to wake up or set an alarm, planning it based on 90-minute increments rather than saying 8 hours. For one thing, many of us do lay in bed for a period of time before we actually fall asleep. So strategizing for just 8 hours in the bed is not necessarily going to yield 8 hours of sleep. And on top of that, our sleep cycles tend to move in 90-minute increments. So if we're going off of 1 hour periods and saying like a flat 1 hour time period, it's not necessarily going to give us a complete sleep cycle, and we may have an alarm going off in the middle of a sleep cycle. So looking at it in 90-minute increments and calculating backwards that way can be more beneficial, with allowing a little bit of extra time on the front end for actually dozing off, because we don't necessarily doze off immediately. And when it comes to sleep anxiety, which is not at all uncommon, that is activating the sympathetic nervous system, activating cortisol and adrenaline. There are certain behaviors that can make that better or worse. One of the things that makes it much worse is watching the clock. Continuously looking at the time, checking the time. I know I went through stages in my life before I knew about this, where I used to do that quite a bit. When I would struggle to sleep, I'd keep looking at the clock and thinking, oh my gosh, I only have 4 hours left. Oh, now it's only 3 hours left, knowing what time I had to get up the next day. That only increases anxiety and stress and doesn't actually do anything at all to help you get to sleep faster. If anything, it makes it much, much worse. So where possible, avoiding having a clock or the ability to see the time when you are having any type of sleep struggle. In fact, the best thing you can probably do for yourself is to take your mind off of it entirely. Sometimes just reassuring yourself it's okay, it's going to be fine. Even if you are worried about how you'll be feeling the next day, that you'll be feeling tired, just kind of reassuring yourself that you'll catch up, it'll be okay. Doing whatever you can to lower that stress level and that cortisol level can have a much more positive impact than stressing yourself out over how much sleep you're losing. And almost kind of just accepting that you're awake. Just allowing it to be, okay, this is what's happening right now. It looks like I'm not sleeping. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and read a book or do something that is relaxing, but not trying to force yourself to lay in bed in torture, unable to sleep. So what are the neurological mechanisms around that? So the anxiety triggers cortisol release. This whole process is activating the default mode network, which is our self-narrative and our story that we're carrying about ourselves not being good at sleeping, worrying about the next day, worrying about how we'll feel. It increases beta wave activity when actually what we're needing is alpha and theta brainwave activity, which is that deeper, more relaxed state. And then there are psychological things happening if we're watching that clock, or we're sort of catastrophizing, which is thinking thoughts like, I'm just going to be useless tomorrow, I'm going to be so tired, it's going to be terrible. And then adding in performance pressure around, I must fall asleep right now, and really putting all that pressure on yourself and all that worry and anxiety about it. Instead, taking all of that performance pressure out of the picture, almost using paradoxical intention, almost trying to stay awake can take that pressure off. And it is recommended usually to leave the bed if there is a lot of anxiety, so that you don't begin to associate laying in bed with that feeling of anxiety and worry that you're not sleeping. Not necessarily like jumping up and going downstairs and watching TV, but sitting somewhere quietly nearby where it's still dark, maybe with very dim lighting, and doing something like reading something that's relaxing, or doing one of these other soothing activities, yoga nidra, meditation, some of these practices of conjuring up different words, or hypnosis or self-hypnosis. And it's interesting because hypnotic states actually show remarkable similarity with sleep onset patterns in terms of EEG readings. So when we have an increase in those theta waves, where we are drifting off to sleep, we also have a reduction in default mode network activity and that negative self-narrative. Hypnosis can be particularly helpful with sleep onset latency, which is the amount of time that we need to fall asleep, because it mimics the brain's natural sleep gate process. And you can use other tools like EFT if you have a lot of anxiety around a particular issue or topic. EFT, which is emotional freedom technique, also known as tapping. It disrupts the amygdala hyperarousal, the amygdala which is responsible for emotions and often anxiety and fear. and it stimulates acupressure points that are connected with our parasympathetic activation, which is our relaxation. And it can help us to kind of process emotional content in a way that alleviates some of the anxieties we may be experiencing. So you could combine some of these tools together, and obviously playing with it in a way that works well for you. But just as a possible proposed strategy, you could do something like start with EFT to address anything that is on your mind. And so this would be for those days where you have something specific you're thinking about or worrying about. EFT is wonderful for reducing that nervous system activation and addressing emotional challenges, and then following it up with some of these other possible things like using yoga nidra techniques to help begin that relaxation response, progressive muscle relaxation, trying out some tools like thinking of different words and different categories using the same letter or the same topic, or reading something relaxing, and then moving into using a tool like hypnosis, letting someone else kind of do the work at that point. So you start with the most active thing, which is the tapping, to the most relaxing activity, and ending with something like hypnosis, which actually guides you down into the alpha and theta brain waves and prepares your mind for sleep. My favorite thing is having a variety of different tools that I can turn to, because sometimes different things work best in different scenarios, and it's not necessarily the same routine every time. And of course, if you are looking to have a variety of tools at your disposal, I do have a mindset membership that includes many of the things we talked about, including EFT tapping videos, yoga nidra audios, and hypnosis audios, which you can listen to at any time whenever you need it. So I hope you found this discussion to be helpful and interesting, and until we connect the next time, I wish you the most magical and creative rest of your day. Thanks for listening. This is Christine Collins at transformcreate.com.